the Ridgeline. The tires of the F-150 chewed through the wet clay, slipping sideways before catching on the exposed bedrock of the ridge. Vance downshifted, letting the engine brake do the heavy lifting as they crawled up the final switchback. In the passenger seat, Buster was wide awake. The treeing Walker hound had his front paws pressed against the door panel, his nose shoved through the 2-inch gap in the window. He wasn't looking for raccoons today. The air pressure had been dropping steadily for the last hour, making Vance's ears pop. The sky above the tree line was the color of a fresh bruise, heavy and rolling. "Almost there, old man," Vance muttered, killing the radio. The static had taken over the FM dial miles ago anyway. They reached the clearing just as the first drop of rain hit the windshield. It sounded like a heavy lead sinker. Vance threw the truck into park, grabbed his canvas duffel, and popped the door. Buster scrambled over the center console, hitting the dirt before Vance even had his boots fully on the ground. The wind was already picking up, whipping the tops of the pines into a frenzy and carrying the sharp, metallic smell of ozone. Tower 4 stood in the center of the clearing, an 80-foot skeleton of rusted iron beams, topped with a 10-by-10 glass box. It had been decommissioned in the 90s, but the Forestry Service still kept the roof patched for emergency layovers. Today, it was their only option. "Up!" Vance shouted over the rising wind. Buster didn't need to be told twice. He hated thunder. The hound practically flew up the zigzagging metal stairs. Vance followed, his boots ringing hollow against the grating. By the time they reached the catwalk at the top, the sky opened up. The rain didn't fall. It blew entirely sideways. Vance fumbled with the padlock, his knuckles white, shoved the heavy wooden trapdoor up, and hauled himself into the cab. He slammed the door shut behind them and threw the deadbolt. Instantly, the roar of the storm was muffled, reduced to a heavy drumming against the panoramic glass. Vance dropped his bag and struck a match, lighting the old Coleman lantern on the desk. A warm, yellow hiss filled the small room. For the first hour, it was just a storm. Vance sat in the solitary swivel chair, eating cold jerky, while Buster curled into a tight ball on an old sleeping bag. The wind battered the glass, making the entire iron structure sway a few inches in either direction. It was a terrifying sensation for a newcomer, but Vance knew the old tower was anchored into solid granite. It wasn't going anywhere. Then, around midnight, the dog woke up. Buster didn't lift his head or whine. He just stood up, his posture rigid. The fur along his spine stood straight up, a jagged ridge from his collar to his tail. Vance stopped chewing. "What is it, boy?" Buster didn't look at the glass walls. He was staring dead down at the wooden floorboards. He let out a low, vibrating growl that Vance felt in his chest. It wasn't a warning. It was a threat. Vance stood up slowly, picking up his heavy maglite. He walked over to the trapdoor. The storm outside was deafening. Rain hammering the roof, wind howling through the iron crossbeams below. There was no way the dog could hear an animal down there. Vance knelt, pressing his face close to a half-inch gap between the floorboards. It was pitch black beneath them. Crack. Lightning spiderwebbed across the sky, illuminating the clearing below for a fraction of a second. Vance stopped breathing. Directly beneath the tower, standing in the mud, was a silhouette. It was too tall to be a bear, but the proportions were completely wrong for a man. Its arms hung too low, the shoulders sharply angled, the head tilted unnaturally upward, staring right back through the floorboards. Darkness slammed back down. Vance scrambled backward, his boots slipping on the dusty wood. He killed the Coleman lantern, plunging the cab into darkness. Buster let out a sharp, hysterical bark, spinning in a tight circle near the trapdoor. Then Vance heard it. Over the chaotic roar of the storm, clang, it was the heavy, unmistakable sound of weight being placed on the bottom metal step. Clang, the second step. The thing was climbing. Vance's hands scrambled in the dark until his fingers wrapped around the cold iron of a heavy pipe wrench he'd seen near the desk. He gripped it with both hands, his palms slick with sweat, and stepped over to the trapdoor. Clang, clang, the footfalls were slow, methodical. The heavy metal stairs shuddered under the immense weight. Buster was losing his mind, unleashing a deafening, continuous baying that rattled Vance's eardrums. The dog snapped his teeth at the wood, his claws scrabbling against the heavy door. Clang! It was on the top landing, right outside. Vance raised the wrench over his shoulder, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He kept his eyes locked on the heavy brass handle of the deadbolt. Slowly, agonizingly, the brass handle twitched. Something on the other side was turning the knob, testing the lock. The thick wood groaned as pressure was applied from underneath. Vance held his breath. Every muscle in his back wound tight enough to snap. The pressure held for 3 seconds. 4 then. A massive crack of thunder shook the entire tower, accompanied by a blinding flash that turned the glass walls bright white. When Vance's vision cleared, the pressure on the door was gone. The handle was still. He didn't lower the wrench. He stood over that trapdoor for 4 straight hours, his muscles cramping, listening to the rain slowly taper off into a soft drizzle, until the gray light of dawn finally crept over the tree line. Buster had collapsed in the corner, exhausted, his chin resting on his paws, watching Vance. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, Vance unlocked the deadbolt and pushed the trapdoor open. The morning air was freezing. He stepped out onto the catwalk, leaning over the rusted railing, and looked down. The clearing was a mess of torn branches and standing water. But right at the base of the metal stairs, pressed deep into the thick red clay, were footprints. They were massive, deeply rutted into the earth, and paced in a tight circle around the iron supports before trailing off into the dense tree line. Vance didn't go down to inspect them. He walked back inside, grabbed his duffel, and looked at the dog. "Come on," Vance said softly. "We're going home."